She was just a hungry girl. Until I saw the necklace I buried with my stolen baby. I was wiping down the counter when she walked in barefoot, shivering, and holding a crumpled paper bag like it was made of glass. Her eyes never quite met mine, but something about the way she scanned the room like she'd memorized every exit before asking to use the restroom set off an ache in my chest I hadn't felt in years. I almost didn't look twice. Almost. Until I saw the necklace. A tiny silver bird with one wing bent, dangling from a chain that looked too old for someone that young to own. My hand stopped moving. My breath caught. Because that necklace had been buried 23 years ago with the baby girl I gave up to protect from the man who threatened to kill us both if the world ever knew. I'd tried to forget, rebuilt my life, changed my name, told no one. But she stood there, wearing proof that the past doesn't stay buried forever. And in that moment, I knew the truth I buried was alive, breathing, and looking right at me, calling me ma'am like I wasn't her mother. Claire Whitman lived her life like a shadow, passing through the edges of a quiet town that had long since stopped asking questions. She rented a modest cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a place where the trees whispered more than the townspeople ever did, and where her name was known only at the local diner and the library, both places she visited at exactly the same time every week. She worked nights at the back office of a logistics company, entering data under flickering fluorescent lights while the rest of the world slept. No one knew where she came from, and no one dared ask. There was something in her eyes that warned people not to dig. She spoke little, kept to herself, and the only photograph in her house was turned face down on her nightstand. Every Sunday morning, she sat on the same church pew but never took communion. She didn't pray, just stared at the stained glass like it might someday break and reveal the truth she kept buried. Her neighbors thought she was kind, but sad. They weren't wrong. Because for 23 years, Claire had carried a secret no one would believe, if she ever said it out loud, a secret that wore a silver bird necklace and had eyes just like hers. It was a stormy Tuesday evening when Claire Whitman stepped into the dimly lit diner, her coat dripping rain, and her mind numb from another 12-hour shift. The place was nearly empty, just a few regulars hunched over their coffee. The low hum of an old radio, mixing with the sound of wind battering the windows. Claire slid into her usual booth at the back, where she always sat with her back to the wall and eyes toward the door. Her meal came quickly: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and black coffee, but just as she raised her fork, a soft voice stopped her cold. "Ma'am, can I eat your leftovers?" Claire looked up, startled, and there she was, a soaking wet little girl, no older than 7, with tangled hair, torn shoes, and eyes too tired for her age. The child stood like a ghost, trembling near the table, her hands clasped behind her back like she'd practiced this question 100 times before. Claire blinked, unsure if she was hallucinating. But the girl didn't move. She was barefoot. The waitress hadn't noticed. No one else had looked. Something ancient and sharp twisted in Claire's chest, a feeling she thought she'd buried forever. She pushed the plate forward silently, watching as the girl devoured the food with quiet urgency. And in that moment, everything Claire had spent 23 years trying to forget came crashing back with the force of a tidal wave. Claire sat frozen for a moment, staring at the child as she scraped the plate with quiet desperation, and something in her shifted not out of pity, but a visceral, aching sense of recognition that rooted itself deep in her bones. Without saying a word, she stood, walked over to the counter, and ordered a full meal: grilled cheese, tomato soup, and a side of warm cornbread, with hot cocoa topped with whipped cream. The waitress raised an eyebrow, but Claire simply nodded, her voice low, firm, for the girl. As the food arrived, Claire placed it in front of the child, who looked up, stunned, as if no one had done something kind for her in a very long time. "What's your name?" Claire asked, but the girl just shrugged, eyes flickering toward the door as if ready to bolt. Claire didn't press. She just watched her eat, memorizing the shape of her small fingers, the curve of her nose, the exact way she tilted her head to the left between bites. A strange heat spread through Claire's chest, a mixture of longing, confusion, and something terrifyingly close to hope. It was as if a part of her she thought had died had come clawing back to life in the form of this child. The resemblance, the eyes, the silence. It all felt hauntingly familiar. As the girl finished the last spoonful of soup, she shifted slightly, and the edge of her damp coat slipped just enough for Claire to catch a glint of silver around her neck. At first, it didn't register, just a flash of metal under threadbare fabric, but then Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes locked on the delicate pendant, a tiny silver star cradled inside a crescent moon, suspended from a fine chain. Time stopped. That necklace wasn't just familiar, it was impossible. It was the same one she had left behind 9 years ago, tucked carefully into a pale pink blanket at the foot of a hospital bassinet, along with a whisper of apology and a prayer that somehow, someday, her daughter would understand. Her hands trembled as memories surged forward, her daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around hers. The nurse's voice urging her to sign the forms, the way she had kissed the baby's forehead and told herself it was mercy, not abandonment. Claire blinked hard, her gaze fixed on that necklace like it held the answers to every nightmare she'd endured since. She wanted to ask, had to ask, but her voice failed her. Instead, she whispered inside her own mind, could it be? Could this girl, this quiet, trembling child, be the daughter she thought she had lost forever? Claire leaned forward, heart pounding, desperate to speak, to ask even a single question. But as she opened her mouth, the girl glanced out the window and seemed to flinch at something in the shadows beyond the glass. Claire reached out, gently touching the girl's arm, her voice soft but shaking. "Sweetheart, can I ask you something? That necklace. Where did you?" But before the words could land, the girl's eyes widened, not with recognition, but fear. She slipped off the stool with the agility of someone used to disappearing, mumbled something inaudible, and dashed out the restaurant door, the little bell overhead ringing like an alarm. Claire bolted up, nearly knocking over her chair, rushing after her into the rain. But the street outside was empty, slick with fresh puddles and lined with closed storefronts. No sign of a child. No sound of footsteps. Just the echo of her own breath and the weight of a moment lost. She turned in slow circles, calling, "Wait, please. I just want to talk." But the girl had vanished into the night like smoke. Claire stood there, soaked and stunned, her eyes scanning every shadow, wondering how someone so close could disappear so quickly, and if fate had just handed her a second chance only to rip it away before she could even hold it. At 16, Claire Whitman lay trembling on the stiff hospital bed, her knuckles white as she clutched the coarse sheets, the sterile scent of antiseptic burning her nose, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glow on the most excruciating moment of her life. Her body ached from hours of labor, but nothing compared to the pain she felt in her chest, the hollow, wrenching ache of knowing she wouldn't be allowed to hold the baby she had just brought into the world. A nurse with a tight smile and cold eyes whispered, "It's better this way, sweetheart. She's going to a good family," as if that could numb the scream clawing at Claire's throat. Her mother stood by the window, arms folded, face hard as stone, never looking back. The doctor never asked her opinion. Papers had already been signed. She wasn't a mother, they made sure she understood that. The moment the cries of a newborn pierced the air, Claire instinctively reached out, but a nurse swiftly turned her head away, placing a barrier between them. "You don't need to see her," someone said. "It'll only make it harder." And just like that, the baby was gone. No name, no weight, no memory except for the echo of a cry and the aching knowledge that part of her had been erased without even a goodbye. The next morning, Claire Whitman sat in her car outside a small law office on Main Street, heart pounding like a warning drum in her chest. The sign still read, "Thomas J. Reed, Family Law," faded from years of sun and resignation. But it hadn't changed since she was 17, desperate, and already broken. Back then, she'd walked through that door begging for help, clutching a wrinkled photograph of a baby blanket and the vague memory of her daughter's birth. Thomas Reed had listened, he always did, but even he couldn't do much. No name, no medical records, no paper trail. He had said then, regret, clear in his eyes. Now, 9 years later, Claire stepped into the same office with something different. A lead, a girl with her eyes, a necklace that didn't just resemble the one Claire left behind, but matched it in every detail. From the tiny etched initials to the worn silver clasp. She needed Thomas to believe her again. "I saw her," Claire said the moment he looked up from his desk. "I think I found my daughter." His eyes widened slightly, but the caution hadn't faded from his voice. "Claire, after all these years I know how it sounds," she replied, breath catching. "But I need you to help me find her. This time, I won't stop." Thomas leaned back in his worn leather chair, fingers steepled, as Claire sat across from him, tension carved into every inch of her frame. Hours had passed since she'd first walked in, and together, they had scoured old records, hospital logs, and adoption filings, most of which were sealed or missing altogether. But just as frustration threatened to consume them, Thomas paused, narrowed his eyes at a digital registry, and muttered, "Wait, this might be something." Claire rushed to his side as he pointed at the screen. Emily Grace McAllister, born the same month, adopted in Hickory Falls, the mother of record Janet McAllister. Claire's breath hitched at the name. She remembered it vaguely from the conversations she wasn't supposed to hear when she was 16, the ones her aunt had whispered to church friends about a God-fearing widow in Hickory Falls who'll do right by the baby. Suddenly, the shadowy outlines of her past were taking shape. Janet McAllister had lived less than 20 miles away all this time. "Emily," Claire repeated, voice trembling. "She goes by Ellie. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be." Thomas began pulling property records, school data, anything public they could access. But something felt off. For all the documents bearing Janet's name, there was almost nothing recent, no school enrollment, no current address, no social activity. "It's like they disappeared," he murmured. Claire, however, had already decided, "Then I'll go to Hickory Falls myself." As Claire sifted through the manila folder Thomas handed her, stiff with time and thick with redacted pages, her eyes caught on a single document that made her pulse stop. It was the official adoption release form. Her name, Claire Whitman, was scrawled across the bottom in rushed cursive. The ink faded but legible. She stared at it, confusion twisting into something colder, darker. "That's not my handwriting," she said slowly, voice brittle with disbelief. Thomas leaned over, adjusting his glasses, examining the signature with narrowed eyes. "You're absolutely sure Claire didn't answer?" She didn't have to. She had been 16, terrified, begging to keep her baby. Her aunt, who had legal guardianship then, had forced her into silence with threats of sending her away. But even then, even at her most desperate, she had never signed that document. "This isn't just forged," Claire said, fury creeping into her voice. "This is fraud." Thomas's face tightened. "We might have something here," he murmured, already flipping through legal codes. Forgery on an adoption release, especially involving a minor, is grounds for reopening the case. Claire's heart pounded. All those years of silence, of wondering, of aching for the face she was never allowed to see, reduced to a lie written in someone else's hand. And now that lie was paper thin. "Who did this?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away, but his expression said what she feared: this wasn't just a mistake. This was orchestrated, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase her from her own child's life. Claire stood at the edge of Hickory Falls, her suitcase worn, her clothes deliberately plain, her long auburn hair pinned into a tight bun under a faded cap. It had taken her 2 days to arrive by bus from Cedar Ridge, a quiet journey filled with rehearsed lines and careful lies. Now, she was no longer Claire Whitman, the woman with a missing daughter and a forged past. She was Clara Willis, a recently widowed housekeeper looking for steady work. With forged references and a borrowed ID tucked in her coat pocket, she made her way toward the residential lanes where the McAllister family was known to live, an affluent street marked by tall hedges, brick facades, and the soft glow of porch lights behind manicured gardens. She'd found an open listing through a local agency, a cleaning position for a neighbor just 2 houses down from the McAllisters. Her goal was proximity, not confrontation. Not yet. She rehearsed her story again in her mind, quiet, respectful, grieving, just trying to get back on her feet. When the door opened, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes glanced over Claire's worn appearance and hesitated. Claire smiled softly, holding her hands clasped, her voice practiced and humble. "I don't need much," she said. "Just a place to work and a chance to be useful." By evening, she had the job, and by morning, she was in cleaning windows that overlooked the McAllisters' backyard, watching carefully for a glimpse of a small girl with chestnut hair and a necklace that shimmered like memory. Claire spent the next few days folding into the rhythms of the household mornings, scrubbing tiles, afternoons, organizing pantries, but her eyes always wandered toward the backyard, where Ellie often played alone beneath the elm tree, sketching in a worn notebook. Her dog curled beside her. One afternoon, while delivering fresh-baked muffins to the neighbor's house, Claire spotted Ellie crouched near the fence, tossing breadcrumbs to a stray bird with a look of deep concentration. "He comes here every day," Ellie whispered, not startled by Claire's presence. "I think he's lost. Like me." Claire knelt down slowly, handing her a muffin. "Then maybe he just needs someone kind to stay near," she replied. Ellie gave the faintest nod, accepting the muffin as if it were a secret shared. Over the following days, their encounters grew more frequent, small, quiet exchanges near the garden hose or while walking the McAllisters' dog. They baked cookies together once when Janet was away, laughing as the flour puffed into the air, leaving white streaks on their faces. Ellie didn't ask questions, and Claire didn't push. Instead, their bond formed like fog lifting over water, gentle, tentative, but real. Two lonely souls who didn't yet know how to say "I miss you," but who found comfort in the shared silence, in the warmth of wagging tails, in the safety of laughter over cinnamon dough and chocolate chips. Janet McAllister had always prided herself on her instincts sharpened from years of navigating boardrooms and charitable galas, reading people like contracts, noting every shift in tone, every glance too long or smile too forced. At first, Claire had seemed like just another housekeeper, polite, efficient, invisible in the way Janet liked her staff to be. But lately, things were off. She noticed Claire lingering too long near Ellie's bedroom door, her eyes flickering toward the girl with an intensity that didn't match a stranger's interest. Then came the muffins Claire's decision to bake without permission, the way Ellie's laughter rang louder when Claire was near. One afternoon, Janet caught a glimpse of Claire gently brushing Ellie's hair from her eyes, a gesture too intimate, too maternal. Her stomach tightened. That night, she reviewed the application Claire had submitted, too sparse, too convenient. No references she could verify. A call to the agency confirmed her unease. No one named Claire Whitman had been placed through their roster. Janet didn't confront her immediately. Instead, she watched. She watched the way Ellie lit up around her, how Claire instinctively reached for the child when she stumbled, how they moved like two puzzle pieces long separated. And deep down, where fear warred with fury, Janet began to suspect the impossible, that this woman wasn't here for work. She was here for Ellie, and Janet had spent far too long building her perfect world to let anyone, especially a ghost from the past, tear it down. Claire moved quietly through the shadows of Hickory Falls, her every step careful, deliberate, driven by the desperate clarity of a mother who had lost too much and waited too long. Each evening after her housekeeping shift, she returned to her rented room above the old bookstore, where she spread documents across a creaky table like pieces of a broken map. She had managed to photograph Ellie's school ID badge, sneak a copy of Janet McAllister's utility bill, and discreetly swipe a crumpled envelope from the recycling bin that bore the McAllister family crest. But it wasn't enough. She needed proof, irrefutable evidence that the adoption papers had been forged, that Ellie was her daughter, and that someone powerful had orchestrated the lie. So she began compiling everything: photos of Ellie's necklace, Claire's hospital bracelet from the night of the birth, and the forged signature that had allegedly relinquished her parental rights at 16. One name kept surfacing in her late-night searches: Maya Lopez, a sharp, relentless investigative journalist who once exposed a corrupt adoption agency in the next county. It was a long shot, but Claire drafted a letter, trembling hands pouring her truth onto paper, and hand-delivered it to Maya's box with a single line scrawled across the envelope. They took my daughter, and now they're raising her under a stolen name. Maya Lopez sat hunched over her desk, the dull hum of the newsroom behind her fading as she clicked through decades-old employment records and campaign finance documents. Something about Claire Whitman's letter had struck a nerve, not just the heartbreak, but the precision, the quiet rage beneath the lines. As she traced the name Janet McAllister, a familiar thread unraveled. Janet, before adopting Ellie, had worked under a different name, Janet Reeve, as a personal aide to none other than Senator Richard Blackwell, a powerful and notoriously secretive figure in state politics. Maya's breath caught as she remembered the whispers from 5 years ago, a string of sealed adoption files, missing consent forms, and mysteriously anonymous parental signatures cases, too scattered to prove, too buried to expose. Blackwell had walked away unscathed, protected by influence, reputation, and the iron grip he held over rural family courts. But now, with Janet's name appearing in both the senator's inner circle and on the adoption papers of a girl whose mother claimed never to have signed away her rights, a pattern was emerging. Maya cross-referenced archive staff rosters, finding Janet listed on key dates tied to other suspect adoptions. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became this wasn't just Claire's tragedy. It was part of something far bigger, and Maya wasn't going to let it disappear into silence again. The truth came crashing down with brutal clarity as Maya pieced together medical records, nurse statements, and a hidden deposition from a former hospital staff member Claire had never willingly signed the adoption papers. On the night Claire gave birth at just 16 years old, sedated and barely conscious from emergency labor complications. A man in a dark suit later identified as Richard Blackwell arrived with an envelope and a notary, according to a trembling nurse's sworn but sealed testimony. Claire's limp hand had been guided to the paper while her eyes remained half shut. Her words slurred, incoherent. Standing beside Blackwell was Janet. Then just his young aide, who allegedly whispered to the nurse that this girl isn't fit to raise a child, do what's best for everyone. The documents were stamped, filed, and locked before Claire ever opened her eyes again. By the time she woke, her baby was gone and a nurse muttered something vague about a good family and you agreed. Remember, but she didn't remember. She had never agreed. She had screamed into her hospital pillow, throat raw and tears violent, but no one listened. Now, nearly a decade later, the truth was rising like a flood, and Claire finally had proof that her daughter had been stolen, not surrendered. Claire stood silently in the corner of the McAllister kitchen, pretending to tidy up, but her eyes never left Ellie. The girl sat at the table, posture rigid, her pencil gripped too tightly, erasing furiously when Janet barked corrections from across the room. "That's not perfect enough," Janet snapped, snatching the paper and replacing it with a fresh one. "Start over. You're representing this family now." Later that day, Claire watched as Ellie was forced into a stiff white dress, her hair sprayed and combed into place, her tiny hands clutching a bouquet she clearly didn't want. A photographer hovered nearby, taking picture after picture as Janet stood beside Ellie, smiling wide and polished for what she called the McAllister Annual Philanthropy Campaign, which featured adopted children in carefully staged portraits to garner praise and donations. Claire's stomach turned when Janet whispered through her teeth, "Smile, Emily. Be the little miracle they want to see." Ellie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Between photo flashes, Claire caught the blankness behind the girl's stare, the shrinking of her shoulders every time Janet adjusted her pose or tone. It was the kind of silence Claire knew too well, the kind born not of shyness but of fear. And she realized with a jolt Ellie wasn't just being raised, she was being curated, molded, owned. In the weeks that followed, Claire observed Ellie's spirit slowly eroding beneath the surface of polished perfection. The girl no longer giggled when flour spilled while baking cookies, no longer reached instinctively to pet the neighbor's golden retriever on their morning walks. Her drawings, once scattered with color and movement, became quiet lines of symmetry and grayscale patterns, as if someone had scrubbed the joy out of her fingers. Every word she spoke was calculated, watched, trimmed to size by Janet's exacting standards. Say thank you properly, Emily, or don't interrupt with nonsense. At dinner parties, Ellie was paraded like an exhibit, reciting lines about gratitude and blessings, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. Claire caught her once, crouched in the hallway with a book in her lap, whispering its story to herself under her breath. The moment she noticed Claire watching, she flinched and snapped the book shut like it had betrayed her. Even the dog, Jasper, had stopped following Ellie around, sensing perhaps the invisible wall that now surrounded her. Claire saw what no one else dared to see. Ellie was being silenced piece by piece, not with violence, but with control so constant, so polished, that it left no room for rebellion, only a quiet, aching vanishing. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while Janet was away at a charity luncheon, Claire found Ellie alone in the sunroom, curled up on the window seat with a book she clearly wasn't reading. The girl looked distant, her eyes fogged with a quiet longing Claire knew too well. Without a word, Claire sat beside her and slowly pulled a faded photograph from her apron pocket creased at the edges, the colors soft with age. It showed a teenage girl, barely 16. her eyes tired but fiercely protective as she cradled a newborn swaddled in a pale blanket. Claire handed it to Ellie with trembling fingers, her voice catching as she whispered. She held on as long as she could. Ellie studied the photo in silence, her fingers brushing over the baby's face, her own brows furrowing slightly as if some deep instinct stirred inside her. She looked up at Claire, questions on the edge of her lips, but still unspoken, as if something inside her wasn't quite ready to believe. Claire didn't push, didn't explain. She simply let the photo rest in Ellie's lap, a small, silent truth placed gently into a world built on well-dressed lies. The air between them held its breath, fragile and waiting. It was past midnight when Claire heard the soft knock on the back porch door, barely audible over the wind rustling through the trees of Hickory Falls. She opened it cautiously, only to find Ellie standing there in her oversized hoodie and rain-damp sneakers, eyes wide with something between fear and curiosity. The girl hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside and pulled the photo from her jacket pocket, the edges now slightly crumpled. Her voice was a whisper, cracked and urgent. "Who are you? Why did I see this photo in my dreams before you ever gave it to me?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. Ellie's hands trembled as she held the picture up again, her gaze locked on Claire with a desperation that pierced right through her. I remember this face," Ellie stammered. "I thought I made it up. But I've seen her holding me. I've felt it. Every night since I was little." Claire's hands instinctively reached out, but stopped just short of touching her. "You didn't make it up," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "That girl in the photo, she's me. And that baby is you." The room fell into silence, except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the invisible weight of a truth long buried, now rising slowly to the surface. Claire took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she looked Ellie in the eye and said, "I'm your mother, Ellie. I didn't give you away because I wanted to. I was 16, scared, and they never let me hold you. Not even once. They told me you were going to a better life, to a family that could give you everything I couldn't." Ellie's eyes widened, her body stiffened, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered, clenching the photo tighter. "That's not possible. My mom is Janet. She raised me." Claire nodded, tears brimming. "I know she did. But Ellie, they forged my signature on the adoption papers. I've spent years trying to find you. That necklace you wear, it's not a coincidence. I left one just like it in the blanket you were wrapped in." Ellie didn't answer. Her mind raced, memories crashing against logic. Janet had never let her ask about her past. She always changed the subject or dismissed her questions. Ellie stared at Claire, her brows furrowed in confusion, anger, something else. She didn't believe her, not entirely, but something deep inside. A tug she couldn't explain. Told her this woman wasn't lying. She didn't want to believe. But she couldn't look away. The feeling was too strong, too familiar. The morning the article dropped, the quiet town of Hickory Falls was shaken to its core. Maya Lopez's investigative piece lit up the front page of the Hickory Chronicle and was quickly picked up by national outlets. The headline screamed, "Stolen Motherhood Inside the Blackwell Adoption Scandal." The story detailed how Claire Whitman, a 16-year-old girl at the time, was drugged after childbirth and coerced into signing papers she never consented to. Maya included evidence of Claire's forged signature on the adoption documents, hospital logs that proved she had not been awake when the papers were processed, and a recorded interview with a former nurse who had overheard Senator Blackwell instructing Janet McAllister to make sure the girl never sees that baby. The article exposed the systemic abuse of power, how Janet, then an assistant to the senator, facilitated the adoption under false pretenses and ensured Claire was silenced. It revealed how Claire's subsequent appeals for custody were systematically blocked, buried under bureaucracy and political pressure. Maya concluded with a stark warning: if this could happen to Claire, it could happen to any vulnerable young woman. Public outrage exploded. Social media ignited. Protesters gathered outside Blackwell's offices. But for Claire, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, finally breathing in daylight. With the truth finally exposed and the public on her side, Claire Whitman walked into the Hickory Falls family court with a fire in her chest and decades of pain clutched in a folder pressed tightly to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed the clerk two documents: one, a formal petition to reinstate her maternal rights over Emily Grace McAllister, and the other, a criminal complaint naming Senator Richard Blackwell and Janet McAllister for conspiracy, forgery, coercion, and the willful violation of her constitutional rights as a mother. The courtroom, once the site of her silencing, now became a battleground for justice. In the petition, Claire detailed how she had never consented to the adoption, how she had been sedated after birth, and how her signature had been forged. She included Maya Lopez's article, affidavits from the nurse who had come forward, and statements from Thomas Reed, her former lawyer. Her complaint against Blackwell was explosive, accusing a sitting senator of orchestrating an illegal adoption to protect his political allies, while manipulating the life of a vulnerable teenage girl. Janet's role, once shadowed in good intentions, now stood exposed as the architect of years of manipulation and emotional abuse. As Claire walked out of the courthouse, the cold January air sliced across her face. But for the first time in 9 years, she could breathe. This wasn't just about a daughter anymore. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been stolen. The courtroom was packed, a low hum of whispers hanging in the air as the judge called the hearing to order. Claire sat on one side, her hands folded, heart pounding in her chest. On the other side, Janet McAllister wore her usual carefully curated smile, but the edges had begun to crack. At the center of it all stood Ellie, no longer the voiceless child posed in picture-perfect portraits for charity brochures, but a young girl finally allowed to speak for herself. The judge invited her to take the stand, and for a moment, the entire room held its breath. Ellie looked around, eyes scanning both women, then settled her gaze forward. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I've spent my life being told to smile for pictures, to behave, to speak right, to make the McAllisters look good. But no one asked how I really felt. I don't need a perfect house or a perfect family. I don't need new shoes or piano lessons if I can't breathe in my own skin." She paused, looked directly at the judge, then said, clearly, "I don't need someone perfect. I need someone who stays when I cry, and doesn't make me smile just for the camera." The room went still. Claire's eyes filled with tears, while Janet's face blanched. In that moment, the court heard not just a testimony, it heard a life reclaimed. Ellie's words, honest and raw, cut through the noise like a bell. The truth was no longer buried under paperwork and performance. It stood in plain sight, wearing a second-hand dress and a necklace too big for her neck, but finally being heard. In a desperate attempt to contain the fallout, Senator Richard Blackwell made his move behind closed doors. He summoned his legal team and whispered offers to Claire's lawyer, sealed settlements, private apologies, even promises of political favor if she would drop the charges and disappear. It was the oldest trick in his playbook: silence the truth with polished checks and veiled threats. But what he didn't know was that Maya Lopez, the persistent journalist who had unraveled the entire scandal, had anticipated this. With her phone tucked into her jacket pocket, camera already rolling. She streamed the encounter live from just outside the courthouse. Her voice stayed calm, professional, but her words landed like fire. This is Senator Blackwell, moments after a court hearing where a young girl spoke truth to power. Instead of accountability, he's offering silence. Watch. Within minutes, the video exploded across social media. Comments flooded in thousands, then millions people enraged, reposting Ellie's courtroom words side by side with Blackwell's backroom offers. Hashtags trended. Let Ellie speak. Justice for Claire. Blackwell exposed. Protesters gathered outside his office by dusk, holding signs with Ellie's quote scrawled in bold letters. His political image, once unshakable, cracked under the weight of public fury. The man who had stolen voices now found himself drowning in a chorus of them, loud, clear, and unforgiving. The courtroom was silent when the judge finally spoke, her voice steady, but not without weight. Temporary guardianship is granted to Claire Whitman, pending further review. Claire's breath caught in her chest, her hands trembling slightly as the words registered. It wasn't everything, not yet, but it was something. A door cracked open after 9 long years of silence and stolen time. Across the room, Ellie sat beside a court-appointed counselor, her eyes darting between faces, her small hands clasped in her lap. When asked where she wanted to stay during the review period, she didn't answer right away. There was a long pause, a flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes. Then came a soft but firm reply. I want to go with Claire. The words were quiet but final. Claire exhaled shakily, eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall in that moment. That evening, back at Claire's modest cottage on the edge of town, neither of them spoke much. Ellie wandered the small living room, running her fingers over dusty bookshelves and worn-out furniture. While Claire reheated soup she barely remembered cooking. It wasn't easy or perfect. Ellie didn't call her mom. She didn't rush into her arms, but she didn't run away either. And in that silence, fragile and uncertain, was the first fragile thread of something new, the beginning of belonging. The news broke early on a cloudy Thursday morning, sweeping across every local station and social media feed like wildfire. Janet McAllister, once celebrated as a philanthropic socialite and adoptive mother, had been officially indicted on multiple charges, including falsifying legal documents and unlawful custody of a minor. The indictment detailed how Janet, with deliberate intent, had forged Claire Whitman's signature on the adoption relinquishment papers while Claire was still sedated post-birth, rendering the entire process fraudulent. Worse still, evidence revealed that Janet had kept Ellie isolated from any biological inquiry, carefully curating the girl's public image while concealing the truth of her origin. The charges sent shockwaves through Hickory Falls, a town that had long admired the McAllister name. Court records, interviews, and Maya Lopez's viral expose were now part of the prosecution's arsenal. Janet was taken into custody at her gated residence without incident, but the stoic mask she'd worn for years had visibly cracked as cameras flashed and neighbors watched. For Claire, it wasn't about vengeance, but truth restoring what was stolen. And for Ellie, it was the shattering of an illusion, the woman she called mom now facing prison for building a life on a lie. Justice had begun to turn. Senator Richard Blackwell, once considered a front-runner for the next gubernatorial race, stood behind a podium in a crowded press room. His jaw tight and eyes hollow as flashbulbs flickered like judgment itself. Effective immediately. I am withdrawing from political life, he announced, his voice strained, each word landing like the slow crumble of an empire. The fallout had been swift and unforgiving. Maya Lopez's expose had gone national, detailing not only his illegal role in the forced adoption of Claire Whitman's daughter, but a broader pattern of coercion, manipulation, and legal intimidation spanning over a decade. Public trust dissolved overnight. Protesters gathered outside his D.C., residents holding signs that read, "Power built on silence and children are not pawns." Once flattering editorials turned savage, allies distanced themselves, and donors vanished. His campaign headquarters shuttered within days. Senate ethics committees launched formal investigations, and whistleblowers began stepping forward, emboldened by the media storm. For a man who had carefully constructed an image of moral leadership and family values, the irony was devastating. In the end, Richard Blackwell wasn't brought down by an election opponent or scandalous affair, but by a mother's quiet fight for justice, a daughter's suppressed voice, and the truth he tried so hard to bury. Claire and Ellie sat across from each other at the small wooden table in Claire's modest kitchen, a soft golden light casting warmth on the worn checkered tablecloth and the two mismatched plates of spaghetti between them. It was quiet, not the strained silence of uncertainty, but the fragile kind of peace that blooms in the aftermath of chaos. For the first time, there were no lawyers, no court officials, no press, no Janet McAllister orchestrating every moment, no cameras waiting to catch Ellie smiling on cue. Just two people, a mother and daughter, trying to relearn the sound of each other's voice. Claire pushed the garlic bread a little closer, unsure whether to speak or wait. But Ellie broke the moment first, softly asking if Claire had always liked cooking. Claire smiled, heart aching and hopeful all at once, and told her about learning to make pasta with her own mother, how she'd once dreamed of opening a diner. Ellie laughed, not the poised, practiced kind, but something genuine, unfiltered, unexpected. They talked about music and dogs and favorite foods and nothing that mattered, and yet everything did. That night, there were no declarations, no forced hugs or sweeping revelations, just food, small smiles, and two spoons clinking against shared dessert. The quiet, imperfect beginning of something real. It happened on a calm Sunday afternoon, the kind that carried no expectations but held the weight of quiet healing. Claire was folding laundry in the living room, humming faintly to a tune from the radio, when Ellie stepped in holding a piece of paper, her expression uncertain but brave. "I talked to the school office," she said, her voice softer than usual but steady. "They said I could request a name change if my guardian approves." Claire looked up slowly, her hands stilling mid-fold, and her eyes met Ellie's. No. Emily's with a flicker of hope that dared not speak first. "I don't want to be Ellie McAllister anymore," she continued, her fingers gripping the form. "That name, it doesn't feel like me. It never did. I want to be Emily Grace Whitman. That's who I was supposed to be." Right, Claire didn't answer with words right away. She simply reached out, gently pulled her daughter into a long, trembling embrace, and whispered yes into her hair, over and over again. That night, they filled out the form together, mother and daughter, reclaiming a name that had been stolen, buried, rewritten without consent. It was more than paperwork. It was the return of a birthright, the restoration of identity, the quiet yet undeniable moment when Emily Grace Whitman stepped back into her own life. That evening, under the soft golden glow of a kitchen lamp and the quiet hum of summer crickets outside the window, Claire and Emily sat side by side at the table with two pieces of crisp stationery in front of them. There was no script to follow, no instruction on how to write to a man who would never read the words, yet whose absence was carved into every moment of the life his daughter had lost and finally reclaimed. Claire began first, her pen trembling slightly as she addressed the letter "Dear Mark." She wrote about the years of silence, the ache of giving birth without a name to whisper to the child, the battle she fought to find their daughter, and the bittersweet victory of holding her again. Then it was Emily's turn. Her words were simpler, but no less powerful. "Hi, Dad," she wrote. "I'm here. I made it. Mom found me. I'm safe now." Her handwriting wobbled at times, but her voice came through steady and warm. She told him she liked chocolate cake, that she was learning how to ride a bike without training wheels, that she had a dog now, and then she wrote, "We missed you, but I think you would have loved the way we found each other." When they finished, Claire folded both letters gently, slipped them into an envelope, and placed it inside the drawer where Mark's photo still stood. It was not about being read. It was about being remembered. About closing the loop. About telling a man who had died, thinking his child was gone forever, that she had survived. And that she had come home. 1 year later, on a crisp morning in early spring, Claire Whitman stood in front of the modest red brick building that would house the newly established Whitman Foundation, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and resolve. The last 12 months had been a whirlwind of healing, legal battles, late-night conversations with Emily, and an unshakable determination to ensure that no young mother would ever have to endure the silence, erasure, and helplessness she once faced. The Foundation's mission was clear and personal: to support young women who had been coerced, manipulated, or forced into giving up their children under pressure from families, institutions, or the legal system. Claire knew their pain intimately, and now she would offer something that had been denied to her advocacy: legal counsel, safe housing, emotional support, and a voice. At the launch ceremony, she spoke plainly, her voice steady, her daughter watching from the front row. "We were told our stories didn't matter," Claire said. "But today, we write them ourselves." The foundation began with 3 volunteers, a retired social worker, and a single phone line, but by the end of the month, they had already helped 2 women begin the process of reunification. Claire wasn't trying to fix the past. She was planting a future, one rooted in truth, choice, and the unwavering belief that no mother should be forgotten. At just 17, Emily Grace Whitman sat in the back of a quiet public library, her fingers gliding over case summaries and legal textbooks far beyond her grade level, her eyes sharp with a purpose most adults couldn't fully comprehend. The trauma of her childhood of being silenced, posed like a doll for political campaigns, denied the freedom to speak, her truth had carved into her a powerful sense of justice. She had once been the child without a voice, the one used as a symbol rather than seen as a soul. But now, with her name restored and her history no longer erased, Emily was determined to make sure no child ever felt as invisible as she once had. Law, for her, wasn't about prestige, it was about protection. She wanted to defend kids caught in custody battles, uncover falsified adoption records, and challenge systems that masked control as care. She had already shadowed 2 legal aid clinics through a mentorship set up by the Whitman Foundation, and each time she watched a frightened teenager get the courage to speak, something deep inside her realigned. Claire often found her awake at night, studying under a desk lamp, writing letters to imaginary clients. When asked why she pushed herself so hard, Emily simply said, "Because someone has to listen when no one else does." On a quiet Sunday morning, the sun filtered gently through the trees lining Hollow Creek, casting golden reflections across the slow-moving water, and Claire walked beside her daughter no longer, Ellie the foster child in someone else's story, but Emily Grace Whitman, her name finally her own. The air smelled of damp pine and wildflowers, and their steps were slow, unhurried, like 2 people finally learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Claire's hand brushed gently against Emily's, and the girl didn't pull away this time. She simply let it rest there. A silent acknowledgement, of something neither of them could rewrite, but were willing to rebuild. Ducks passed them in the shallows, and a dog barked distantly from a neighboring trail. But Hollow Creek was theirs this morning. No cameras, no courtrooms, no stolen documents or accusations. Just a mother and her daughter walking through a place that had once held ghosts, now made real by presence. There were still wounds that ached in the quiet, memories that might never fully heal. But love lived here now in shared glances, in quiet laughter over muddy shoes, in the way Emily leaned her head just slightly against Claire's shoulder as they paused by the water. Together. Not perfect, but together. In the end. Claire and Emily's story is more than just a tale of lost years and stolen names. It's a testament to the quiet, relentless power of truth and presence. In real life, we don't always get the perfect moment to make things right. Sometimes the people we love most are taken from us by decisions we didn't make or by systems stronger than our voices. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. Claire was once a 16-year-old girl with no choice, no voice, and no rights. And yet, years later, through persistence, courage, and love, she found her daughter again, not in a grand reunion, but in a series of quiet gestures, a meal shared, a photo remembered, a name reclaimed. Life won't always give us second chances, but when it does, we must be brave enough to take them not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. If you're someone who has ever felt silenced, pushed aside, or made to believe that your truth doesn't matter, this story is for you. Keep showing up, keep speaking, even if your voice trembles. And if you've ever been on the other side, if you've taken part in someone else's silence, it's never too late to listen, to learn, and to change. Families aren't built in courtrooms, they're built in kitchens, on park benches, in quiet walks by creeks, with presence and love over time. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Have you or someone you know ever searched for a missing connection? Save this video to remind yourself that healing is always possible. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Your voice and your presence matters.